chair of the British Architectural Library Trust. The Trust is the non-profit entity that supports the extraordinary library and collections of the Royal Institute of British Architects in London. This is the fourth and concluding presentation in our 2026 lecture series, Brutalism, Architecture, Urbanism, and Representation. Today's lecture is entitled Brutalism, Today and Tomorrow. As a movement, brutalism had enormous impact on architecture throughout the world. It continues to resonate and affect design today. Brutalist architecture's bold forms and expressive sculptural qualities gave buildings a sense of power and materiality. Today, despite an ongoing reappraisal and growing appreciation for brutalist architecture, many of brutalism's finest examples are threatened. Today's lecture will assess brutalism's current standing, evaluating its formal qualities, and considering the significant natural resources required in its construction and ongoing operation. The lecture will be presented by Barnabas Calder. Barnabas is the senior lecturer in architecture at the University of Liverpool. He is a specialist in post-1945 architecture and an authority on the work of Sir Denis Lasdun. He received a BA degree at Oxford, a master's degree in history of art and architecture at the Courtauld Institute, and a PhD degree in the history of architecture at Cambridge. He then spent 2 years at the British Architectural Library, cataloging and researching Lasdun's archive. Following his work at the RIBA, Barnabas served as a lecturer at the University of Strathclyde. Barnabas is the author of Raw Concrete, The Beauty of Brutalism. The interlocutor for today's lecture is the noted architectural writer, editor, and consultant, Hugh Pearman. Hugh currently serves as a trustee and chair of C20, the 20th Century Society. For 30 years, Hugh served as the architecture and design critic for the Sunday Times and has been a frequent contributor to other publications as well, including The Guardian, The Observer, The Wall Street Journal, and The New York Times. He also edited the RIBA Journal from 2006 to 2020. Hugh is an honorary fellow of the Royal Institute of British Architects and also serves on the Trust Advisory Council of the British Architectural Library Trust. Hugh has served as a visiting professor of architecture at the Royal College of Art and honorary vice president of the Architectural Association in London. Following Barnabas's lecture, Hugh will join him for further conversation. And now it's my great pleasure to introduce Barnabas Calder.
Thank you very much. Thank you for the invitation and thank you for attending. Like all the best talks about the visual arts, I will start with a really dry graph. This graph, I argue, explains brutalism. What it shows you is the radical increase in energy consumption worldwide in the post-Second World War decades. Specifically from 1950 to 1979, the span of brutalism, worldwide energy consumption more than tripled. That rocketing increase in energy consumption is what made brutalism happen and what made it thrive globally. I would argue, in fact, that brutalism was a great roar of excitement about energy change in architectural form. It celebrates the confluence of mature oil technology and coal technology and the sheer outrageous amount of energy available to the architects and clients of the 1960s and 70s, enabling architects worldwide to do things they'd never been able to do. And the best architects responded with thrilling excitement, from the most modest scale of an architect just finishing his training, going off to a Scottish, most remote corner of the Scottish coast and building a little holiday hut for himself as a self-built project, through to spectacular public and religious projects like this church outside Florence, which is clearly reveling in the potential of concrete and steel to produce shapes that had never been seen before, to play games that had never been playable before in architectural materials available up till then, all made possible by the huge energy intensity of steel and concrete, both of which had been known for millennia, but were only used on this kind of scale once coal was cheaply available to provide the heat to make them. Brutalism shot upwards into the skies using this very modest amount of space that is taken up by a concrete and steel structure to enable it to go high, using the reliable electricity supply to power lifts to enable it to build high. Completely changing cityscapes, completely changing the density at which you could build. With these new palette of materials, architects were able to produce total works of art of a sort that the most ambitious Baroque architects would have passionately envied. This is Paul Rudolph in Boston, producing a government functional building with a series of not particularly glamorous functions, where the freedom of concrete and steel enables him to make this landscape, which looks as though it's only missing a caterpillar, a giant caterpillar smoking opium, to be straight out of Lewis Carroll. This is the staircase in the same project, which slops out in a way that Michelangelo would have regarded as a bit self-indulgent and a bit melting. And it enabled architects to operate in new ways, with playing new levels of architectural games and expressing their theoretical ideas in buildings. This is a building in Florence where that tall drain pipe you can see right in the center of the photo needs to disappear into the building so that it's not damaged by passers-by. But that feels to the architects like a breach of modernist honesty. So in order to deal with it, they put this little window in so that you can see that the drain pipe hasn't disappeared dishonestly, it's gone inside. Unbelievable level of unnecessary, overthought, fun detail made possible by the cheapness of these very energy-hungry materials. Concrete and steel allowed you to build in very large volumes, quite fast, and fairly cheaply for a huge diversity of architectural purposes. And new servicing also revolutionized the ways that you could build. This is three well-known buildings from Liverpool seen from above, and in each case they look very solid from ground level, but being buildings of the early 20th century, they have to have light wells to bring in air and natural light to the offices deep within them. That means that they're much less voluminous than they look. The actual office space available in these big buildings is quite modest by later standards. In the post-war period, brutalist buildings were able to fill any size of plan because you could artificially light it with cool lighting technologies that didn't cause you overheating problems and weren't more expensive than you could afford, thanks to the cheapness of energy by this period. And you could also artificially ventilate, so you could get any depth below ground and any distance from a window and still be able to function perfectly well for the first time. And this meant that it was worth redeveloping anything you possibly could in existing buildings in cities if there was any kind of demand for property, because you could redevelop at so much greater a density. So this is another Liverpool building that profits from that, and you can see a ground floor of parking, several layers of parking as a kind of podium, and then this enormously deep plan where windows are used essentially as an optional resource to provide views, not as an essential aspect of ventilation and lighting. And that's completely new in this post-war period. New roads come to cities in unprecedented profusion. And again, this is through energy change. The massive increase in the availability of affordable gasoline, petrol for cars in the post-war period makes car ownership hugely increase in wealthy countries. And the sense that they are part of human beings' freedom to choose means that they are accommodated at the cost of the existing city fabric. Roads are forced through existing neighborhoods, typically poor ones. You can see that as a political conspiracy or as a land value question, but in either case, it produces the same effect of considerably increasing disadvantage for those around these huge new road schemes. But they do enable ever-growing numbers of people to commute by car, to drive further out to suburbs, and to come into dense city centre. And the parking that was required is also provided in brutalist buildings, with a huge number of city centre brutalist buildings having multi-storey car parking structures underneath them and around them. Totally straightforward in brutalist terms, very difficult in older buildings because landing the structure of the housing and shops above this car park through the car park without excessive amounts of wall breaking up the car park is easy on concrete columns and very, very difficult on masonry walls of a more traditional block-based sort. As a response to all this increased car movement, there's an increased interest too in separating pedestrians from the car level, both for the pedestrians' sake and to smooth the flow of traffic so that you can drive everywhere as fast as you like. And the range of uses for these brutalist buildings is truly vast. They include a huge increase in hospital provision in all affluent countries. Whatever the system on which they're doing it, whether it's insurance-based or public health system-based, enormous concrete hospitals are a familiar part of the landscapes of the industrialized world. Universities, too, expanded extremely aggressively in the post-war decades, and you see a very self-confident architecture of proud newness and proud scale bashing into campuses everywhere, both city centre campuses like this one at the University of London and in the many, many campuses that expanded outside cities around the world. Provision for the arts, so often materialized in brutalist form. These are concert halls in London next to the Royal Festival Hall on the south bank of the River Thames, and they were built to meet a need for different sizes of concert hall than London currently had in that period. So they are quite a luxurious extra, and they're produced in this really tough brutalist language by a group of young architects who were given the commission from within the London County Council's architecture department and who massively enjoyed the freedom of the windowlessness of concert halls to really play with how cliff-like and aggressive and natural phenomenon-like you could make architecture. And of course, housing was provided on an enormous scale, not just in social democratic contexts. There were also big housing programs under Franco in Spain, and of course in Soviet countries. This provision of new, better housing for ordinary and disprivileged people was a huge feature of the post-war city. And this particular example, Trellick Tower, is a really emphatic celebration of energy change. That detached, semi-detached service tower on the left is there for the lifts, which are a very new facility for anyone but the very rich. And the boiler house, which, because it's an oil-fed boiler house, can be at the top of the column with the oil being pumped up to it. So the dirty smoke, which is harder to handle than the clean oil, only has a short chimney, and the clean oil travels a long way up a steel pipe to get to the boiler house. And that makes perfect sense in functional terms, but it also opens up this wonderful opportunity to advertise to people for miles around, because this is a very, very visible block, that everyone in this new block is being given central heating and hot and cold running water in every flat, which a lot of people in the middle classes in houses they owned themselves didn't have to the same quality in the mid 1960s when this is getting planned and built. This is a really enthusiastic celebration of energy, cheap fossil fuel energy's capacity to change the lives of human beings everywhere. The concrete that makes it all possible is a very industrial material. It's produced through heating limestone or chalk very hot with coal heat mostly, and a few other minerals added. That is then the cement, which is mixed in with sand and water and gravel to produce a kind of lumpy sludge that you can pour into molds and turn into a building. This is the concrete at the National Theatre in London, and you can see that it's been cast into these immaculate wooden molds that leave their presence very carefully clear on the surface. And treatments that play with the textural capacity of concrete are extremely common through the period, trying all sorts of variations, enjoying the potential to both show you how it's made and to produce a texture that has an impact at an architectural aesthetic level. This is the South Bank Centre again, and these incredibly aggressive dark stone panels are there because the older architects and the clients objected to the young architect's decision to do the whole thing in wood printed in situ concrete, and instead they insisted that they put stone aggregate panels on the outside, panels with stones on the outside on the a lot of the facade so that it wouldn't be so aggressive. And I'm pretty sure that the young architects chose the most aggressive, unfriendly looking panels they could find in order to stick middle finger up at the what they saw as the fuddy-duddies trying to control their artistic vision. As well as being an exciting surface, concrete and steel together are so strong and so versatile to engineers that they enable enormous buildings to hover almost freely above spaces below. What you're seeing in this picture is flats above a lake, but the lake in turn is above a London Underground railway line, and there are concert halls beneath ground here as well. And because concrete takes the shape of whatever you pour it into, it also opened up for the architects who wanted to play with that the possibility to be extremely sculptural and to play with shape in whatever way they wished. This in Chicago by Bertrand Goldberg. This is, to a fairly unprecedented extent, a worldwide movement. This is Abidjan, a photo from the early 2000s, but you can see on the left a really expressive piece of brutalism, La Pyramide, and through the rest of it, lots of more ordinary commercial brutalism of a more kind of blocky sort. Brutalism was widely used as a gesture of modernity for newly independent countries coming out of colonial contexts. And also across the Soviet bloc, the similarities are much more striking than the differences, despite the very different rhetoric that was attached to them for the huge quantity of big buildings that I think in the West we would describe very cheerfully as being brutalist. These buildings are monuments to their time's belief in a consequence-free ability to use all that new cheap energy to change the world massively and quickly, and to make artificial environments as divorced from the outside world as if they were a space station, fully controlled and mechanized. Many architects believed they could really make a difference to people's everyday lives, far, far better through these new superpowers than they'd been able to without concrete, steel, and servicing. That optimism feels remote to me now, and the buildings it leaves to us, the brutalist buildings that are our legacy today from this movement, often look beleaguered, shabby, badly modified, and sad. In wealthy countries, many or most brutalist buildings are currently under serious threat of demolition or devastating alteration, or have already gone or been so heavily altered that they might as well have been. A lot of them sit on such big urban sites that their promoters uh, managed to pull together in those bullish days of the 1960s and 70s when demolition was seen by civic authorities as a badge of progress. So these huge sites are very attractive to developers, particularly now that demolishing older buildings is harder, whereas demolishing one big brutalist project opens up a huge space for lucrative new construction. This is made all the easier by the fact that so many brutalist buildings are now at least a bit shabby. Public and planning ignorance about the technical aspects of concrete and steel make it easy to demonize shabbiness. Bits of wear and tear on the surface get badged with the meaningless term concrete cancer, allowing hysteria at that medically terrifying term to throw a cloak of safety concerns over the wasteful destruction of a building which only actually needed a modest amount of repair. The widespread use of in situ reinforced concrete in brutalist buildings, that's concrete poured in place into big molds and often forming large continuous elements that run through multiple stories, that can make it hard to adapt them, more hard than with brick or steel structures where you can more easily cut components out and replace them. And that these restrictions require imagination and skill to bring disused spaces back into good functionality, which probably provides another fairly frequent obstacle to reusing our brutalist legacy. I also think that people are more happy to adapt themselves around the particularities of older heritage buildings. Brutalism doesn't seem to be given that pass very easily. People expect buildings from that recently to be extremely functional, even though the world has changed so much since the 1960s and 70s. Whereas you put them in a 17th century building and they find it attractive and quaint that it has all the problems it has in terms of comparison to a contemporary building's functionality. So the combined result of these various pressures is a continuous and rapid attrition of our stock of brutalist buildings. Against this tide of destructiveness are a few cheering countercurrents. The first of these is that many people's attitudes to brutalism are now a lot more positive than they were at the start of this century. When I announced, even to my art history student friends in 2002, that I intended to embark on a PhD on Dennis Lasdon's National Theatre building and its architecture, they literally hooted with gleefully derisive laughter. At that time, most people simply couldn't see the qualities that now seem so obvious in brutalism. To the point where someone could look up at this spectacular tower in the Barbican in London and think, we need something sculptural here. I know, 2 little metal dolphins will do it. Today, it's much commoner than it used to be to meet real enthusiasm for the great monuments of brutalism. And often that renewed enthusiasm for brutalism comes with a political freight that's distinctly different from the way these things were read politically in the 1960s and 70s. Today's brutalism fans often associate the whole style with the expanding welfare states of the period, whereas at the time, corporate brutalism was seen as an epitome of capitalist excess. The wonderful research done by Hugh Harrison on Seifert, who designed this block, records that that this building was described as a topographical cyst and a symbol of hatefulness by left-wing architectural critics at the time it was completed. And now it's just greeted along with the rest of Brutalism by most Brutalism fans as being a wonderful piece of heritage from the 1960s. Like so much else, attitudes to brutalism seem to have become victims of the crude polarities of left-right culture war, with in America and Britain, right-wing politicians making populist statements about opposition to brutalism at a puzzling point to do so, since nobody's been doing it for decades in aesthetic terms. More good news is that a rigorous historical understanding of brutalism and its context has been hugely increased by an impressive cohort of historians. One of the very distinguished urban historians of brutalism, Otto, spoke earlier in this series. And heritage protection has been secured for many of the most outstanding buildings in a wide range of countries. This slide is deliberately blank if you're worrying that my presentation's gone wrong. In England, this heritage work was pursued with extraordinary zeal and rigour by the late Elaine Harwood, who from the early 1990s fought almost universal hostility and bafflement to secure protection for outstanding brutalist buildings that we would now have lost or partially lost without her. The RIBA, British Architectural Library, where Valeria works with the photographs, had the courage and foresight to collect entire archives of Erno Goldfinger, Dennis Lasden, and Leslie Martin, and other groups of brutalist material, and started to do so at a point where brutalism was still in general hateful disfavour, despite hostility and the big challenge of accommodating, conserving, and making accessible very large bodies of papers, drawings, and photographs from this period, whereas older archives tended to be very much smaller. So they've done a fabulous job of coming to terms with the big challenges, and the result is an unparalleled collection on British post-war architecture and brutalism. The Getty Conservation Institute has done wonderful research and funded top quality restoration projects for a group of concrete modernist buildings worldwide. And campaigning organisations, including Docomomo internationally and the 20th Century Society in Britain, have fought tirelessly and really effectively to change public opinion and to spread understanding and sympathy for once hated styles, notably brutalism. Lots of publications and social media posts celebrate the strong aesthetics in the style, and I would even claim my own modest place in the movement with my book that came out 10 years ago this week, which masquerades as a history book, but is perhaps more of a protracted love letter to neglected 1960s architecture. At the moment, some brutalist buildings have made it safely through their difficult time and come to be appreciated and really well refurbished and restored. One of these is Boston's wonderful City Hall by Kalman, McKinnell and Knowles. Very, very well refurbished recently. And another is Marcel Breuer's Pirelli building in New Haven, Connecticut, which is now the Hotel Marcel, which has not only undergone major refurbishment, but has done so to try to achieve and to succeed in achieving the highest contemporary standards of energy efficiency in a new building. As a retrofit, that's an extraordinary achievement. At the same time, world-class buildings are being lost and are under threat of being lost. If Paul Rudolph's astonishing Boston Government Services Center is lost or badly damaged, and the threat has been continuous for years, that will be as great a heritage bereavement as the loss in the 1960s of Pennsylvania Station in New York. They are comparably outstanding as pieces of architecture of their periods. So far, I've been largely positive in my appreciation of brutalism's legacy today and tomorrow. The actual buildings we have from the period are often fine pieces of architectural art, making strongly positive contributions to the sum of human experience. Beneath this appreciation, however, is an undertow of anxiety and guilt. The environmental cost of making and running brutalist buildings was very high. Looking back at the dominant architectural attitudes of the 1960s and 70s, they seem, from today's perspective, astonishingly indifferent to the impacts of so much construction on the natural environment. Looking back from what we know now, this blindness to ecology looks like a horrendous mistake, albeit one made in good faith. Brutalist buildings were brought into being by industrial processes powered by burning coal and by transport powered by burning oil. They heated themselves with greedy fossil fuel boilers, and fossil fuel power stations ran their many fans, light fittings, lifts, and air conditioning units. The energy cost of buildings in the mid-20th century was very high. Every meter squared of useful space in this block of concrete flats in Moscow cost, according to Florian Urban and John Burns's calculations in our recent book together, 250 times more energy to produce per meter squared than this Scottish croft built just 80 years earlier. But were the residents of the Moscow block 250 times happier? Or were they 250 times healthier? Where has all that extra energy gone in terms of actual human good? With ubiquitous fossil fuel use in architecture, our resource consumption has become absurdly profligate, buying unneeded luxuries today at the expense of basic requirements of life for humans in a few decades' time. In this context, one of the great challenges surviving brutalist buildings face is bringing them up to date for today's environmental understanding. Brutalist buildings were built on the assumption that energy was cheap and getting cheaper and would continue to do so until it was literally too cheap to meter. Keeping them to today's comfort levels, given how leaky they therefore are, is very, very energy expensive. And often that is cited as a reason to demolish them. Replacement buildings will use energy more efficiently once completed. But this is terrible logic. The replacement buildings, in fact, cost tens of thousands of tons of carbon dioxide to build before their doors even first open. And those are tons of carbon that their later efficiency won't actually remove, they're just theoretical savings. Instead, we could radically cut the expectations of alleged comfort and use the existing buildings with some light retrofit and a cultural campaign to help users to understand the need to wear a jumper in winter and shorts in summer. This isn't just a way of saving enormous amounts of energy for construction and running of buildings. It's also an enrichment to our lives. Lisa Heshong, in this wonderful book, which I strongly recommend, it's very short and very good, argues that keeping all buildings to a very narrow range of internal temperature and other conditions is wasteful not only of energy, but also of human experience. She makes the point that your memory condenses all those identical days of what she calls thermal beige into a single, squashed, homogenized sausage of human experience. Think of the international hotel room. Wherever on earth you have spent a night in an international hotel room, it is identical, identically forgettable, however far you've flown to get to it. Whereas I bet you recall the cool of a courtyard in a hot country, or the coziness of a crackling fire on a cold evening, with an immediacy and delight that is fundamentally enriching to your quantity and quality of life experience. Keeping our existing brutalist buildings and using them less wastefully is critical to our viability as a species. Constructing new buildings and running our existing ones is contributing 37% of all greenhouse gas emissions, 37% of the climate emergency. We are for now at the top of the slippery slope of climate collapse, but already our emissions are driving forest fires, lethal heat waves, crop failures, and mass migration. Climate collapse will kill billions if we carry on like this, and not only in poor countries or in some remote future. Your youngest relatives may well live poorer lives, scarred by instability and disaster, and die sooner and more unpleasantly because of our emissions, and buildings are causing over a third of that harm. And a huge part of this is the negative legacy of brutalism. Not the buildings, but the ideas and techniques that it leaves us. Despite decades of discussion of moving away from brutalism, first for postmodernism and then for, in quotation marks, sustainable architecture, brutalism has in fact remained continuously the dominant style beneath a thin skin of other styles. Whether that's postmodernist historicism, slick glazing, or nowadays, pot plants glued to the outside as a kind of sacrifice to the gods of nature. I'm conscious here that I'm going fairly hard in my critique of contemporary practice, and normally you'd have a chance to get your riposte in at the end. I promise I haven't only been so harsh because you don't get a chance for a comeback within today's format. So here are my social media details if you want to track me down and disagree and give your counter arguments. I'm the world's only Barnabas Calder, so I'm easy to track down. So at present, we're pulling down viable brutalist buildings, often with sustainability claimed as a reason, and building essentially new brutalist buildings. Not brutalist in their surface appearance always, but brutalist in their fundamentals. Heavily serviced buildings of concrete, steel and glass built at an immense cost of energy and carbon. In the most devastating sense, brutalism won. Even as we condemn its surviving buildings for their environmental destructiveness, we are building most new buildings to the exact same principles. And worse, the quality of the replacements seems destined to make them very short-lived. In Britain, at least, I'm not as up to date with the situation in the US. We are building systems with sticky tape and plastic sheeting essential to their functionality, and these tapes and sheets are often specified only for a life of 15 years, but are then often put behind a brick wall. What happens at the end of the 15 years? Some of these new shoddily built buildings don't make it to the 15 years. This is one which was caught by a passing van and has never been repaired since and just gently deteriorates by the year. This one, it's not even a vehicle that's done this, it's in a pedestrianised area. Someone has leant on this or bumped into it as a human being and broken the cladding. I suspect now that quite a lot of British buildings, newly built British buildings, would be easier to burgle by punching through the wall than they would by breaking a window. We are thinking about buildings exactly wrong, demolishing the buildings we already have, whilst the tens of thousands of tons of CO2 emitted to produce them are still in the atmosphere, causing dangerous heating. And we do this to build things that we hope will consume somewhat less energy each year once completed, but the actual outcome is continually rising carbon dioxide levels in the atmosphere. At the moment, our built environment has learnt precisely the wrong lessons from brutalism. To default to demolition and reconstruction, to build using lots of concrete and steel, to service buildings heavily in pursuit of narrow definitions of comfort, and to build in car dependency to cities. Instead of continuing to learn these devastatingly wrong lessons, we should instead learn from the fearless radicalism of the brutalist generation. whose response to a period of rapid energy change was to tear up all the rules of how cities and buildings operated and to produce a magnificent artistic response to the changing energy conditions of their time. We should apply that can-do spirit of radicalism to the urgent energy change we need now, fully abandoning the fossil fuels that make up 80% of the human energy supply. The radical spirit of brutalism is needed now to overturn the destructive norms established by brutalism first time round. So if there's one thing I'd like you to take away from the story of brutalism today and tomorrow, it's this: that we need to change our definitions of what we want from buildings. At the moment, the dominant model of architectural sustainability is to establish what a proposed building will provide in the way of spaces, temperatures, and functionality, then to look at how the environmental harms of meeting these requirements can be somewhat reduced by spending a bit of extra money on more efficient machinery, better insulation, or solar panels. Instead, we have a much more powerful tool for reducing environmental harms, and that is to reduce the amount of amenity we are expecting from our architecture. To air condition less, to heat less, to do less with our buildings. Unlike most improvements, this saves money as well as improving environmental performance. We don't need such a narrow thermal range. It shortens our experience of life, it kills the seasons, and it worsens our relationship with the outdoor world. We don't need whatever the latest trend has defined as the optimal working conditions for every hour of our working life. We can instead open a laptop in any comfortable seat, wherever there's a Wi-Fi connection. Most people's work has literally never in the whole of human history and prehistory been so flexible. Yet we treat ourselves architecturally as hypersensitive machines, like the first ever computers with their fragile, expensive vacuum tubes, needing special conditions of cooled, treated air and a big, new, purpose-built space, all at exorbitant energy cost. We know for sure that our finicky overspecification of comfort standards is contributing to making conditions of lethal instability for many humans worldwide by the later decades of this century. What possible increase in office comfort or air quality could be worth intensifying that? Wouldn't it instead be better to live with a light footprint, imaginatively repurposing the spaces left to us by brutalist architects, wrapped up warmly in winter, and taking a siesta in the peak afternoon heat of ever warmer summers? Let's abandon Mises' famous dictum that less is more and replace it with the truth that enough is enough. Thank you very much.
And thank you, Barnabas. If we can probably, that's it, move on to the discussion bit. It's great, and I've been following, obviously, your writings over the years, and this is a very excellent summation of your work in this area. I was thinking just the other day, as I think, watching some classic Hitchcock movie, and it was New York in the summer. And everybody was sweating and they were lying down and men were coming around with blocks of ice, stuff like that. And it is something where it's only comparatively recently, even in America, which is obviously far in advance of us in the UK on this, that this narrow permitted band of comfort conditions within buildings became normal. And prior to that, people used other techniques. And that made me think that one of the problems about buildings reaching what is thought to be the end of their economic life is not often the structure of the building, it's usually the services. all the ducts and wires and pipes, heating, cooling, all of that. 25-year life, really, tops, for that. And so it's when built, as we know at the 20th century society very well, that's the dangerous age particularly for post-war buildings, because that's the age at which they need to have their guts ripped out and replaced, probably. And while they're about it, we might as well knock the whole lot down. Very much the way which the construction industry operates. And that also explains what you were saying, which is that it's those modern buildings, those brutalist period buildings, which are the hardest to economically justify the refurbishment of, in a sense, for that reason. Whereas with older buildings which were designed to open windows, buildings which have got courtyards, for instance, less of a problem, and they convert perhaps more easily. So would you say that, given all of that, and given that you do know some examples you've given us there, like the Breuer Hotel, the Marcel Hotel, for instance, of reusing these buildings, you say it's difficult, but it's clearly not impossible. It can be done. I mean, is there and you mentioned the monolithic construction difficulties of this in the sense that you have to sort of smash holes through things, but it can be done. And do you think that techniques are now emerging to make that more possible or more acceptable? Or is it just that they are too expensive?
The most sustainable option is also by far the cheapest, which is to do nothing of that.
Yes.
When people determine that machinery has reached the end of its life, you can either replace it with the latest version of that machinery, or you can look into how much machinery is actually needed and try and get by with as little as possible. My slide, late slide of sofas in a brutalist, sort of stripped out brutalist interior, is from a Brussels bank that fell into disuse and was then squatted, and then became a legal and formal version of that as an arts centre. And the same structure that housed the bank with heavy servicing now houses nightclub, art facilities, university activities, without nearly so much in the way of finishing and servicing, and it works fine. There are some circumstances in which you have to artificially ventilate because you really are too far from any natural ventilation, but they're not nearly as common as the servicing industry seems to want people to believe. And the challenge of all of these servicing challenges is to meet ever narrower definitions. And when you look at 1960s definitions, it was frequently the case that the expectation was for it to be 16 degrees indoors in winter in a habitable space in which people wouldn't be moving, 8 degrees in a space where they would be moving. Keeping to those temperatures, even without insulation, is very much less demanding on the boiler than keeping the same building to 22 degrees in the same external temperatures as we now do, because we seem to have at some point decided that human beings can't cope with cooler temperatures than that. And that is, there are people who call it regulatory capture, which is where the world's regulations are strongly guided by professional experts who are themselves consultants in putting in machinery. And mysteriously, when you ask foxes for advice on chicken security, you don't end up with many chickens left. And the same phenomenon happens when consultants have excessive power in guiding regulation, that the regulations end up forcing you as a legal requirement to install unneeded equipment.
The evidence is there also, even actually in my lifetime. The other day I dug out some photo of me in my first job in London in the late 1970s, and I'm very warmly dressed. I'm indoors. I'm wearing a tweed jacket. I'm wearing a sweater underneath the tweed jacket. I've got a tie on. I am actually sort of well insulated. Even then, I think there was a greater temperature range which was permitted within office buildings than we're used to now. that aspect of it also intrigues me. One other thing you mentioned there, and this came onto the ticky-tacky architecture we're building now, the architecture of tape and thin board with a light dusting of tiling or something on the outside. We've all seen such buildings. Have you come across, or what would you say would be today's equivalent material to concrete to make a solid building, a building which you can run into with a truck and not necessarily knock a hole through it, or indeed with your elbow, in the case of some of them? Are the materials coming forward which could be used in construction to create that kind of massive architecture?
They're not coming forward, they're going backward. Firstly, I would say that we shouldn't be building with an amount of structural redundancy that allows truck strike not to cause problems. We should deal with that by landscaping, and so that you can't get a truck against the wall of the building. But to build robust, fireproof or fire-resistant, long-lasting structure, the most attractive emerging option is stone. Structural stone. Stone is thought of as very expensive because the current architectural stone industry is obsessed with perfection of appearance, and therefore a very large percentage of all stone extracted is immediately wasted because it doesn't have the correct appearance. There's visual flaws. If you instead employ that visually imperfect, in quotation marks, because actually the flaws are often have their own beauty. If you apply that stone as a structural material, then you can build very robustly with extreme reduction in energy consumption. In the book that I referred to in the talk that's just come out with Florian Urban and John Burns, we compared two 19th century tenements, one in Berlin made of brick, fired clay brick, and the other in Glasgow made of structural sandstone. And they are functionally and spatially almost identical. And the energy consumption for the brick one is more than twice the energy consumption to build the stone one. So just that one substitution of a fired material for a non-fired material can save you more than half the harm your building is doing before its doors open. And the downsides are pretty limited. Stone is available very widely around the world. It's extremely reusable at end of life if you don't concrete it together, if you lime mortar it together or use gravity to hold it together. You can reinforce it lightly if you need to, so that it functions like a concrete reinforced beam by drilling one hole through it and putting a piece of steel through it. It has astonishing versatility and quality as a material. And a massively better footprint. I don't think we should be building as much as we are anyway, but what we still need to build, we should use stone, and where we have to, timber.
This does bring us on to I suppose it's a political point, but it strikes me all the time that our economy is so tied up, and the construction economy is so tied up in an endless cycle of demolition and rebuilding. That it is seen almost to be well, to use terms of today, anti-growth or anti-this or anti-that, to stand in the way. This is something we find that 20th century society, it's sometimes seen as being needlessly preservationist, you might say, even though, obviously, as you say, the greenest building, or as you say, as everybody says, the greenest building is one that already exists. But nonetheless, the economy is tied up in that. It's a very difficult cycle to break, isn't it?
Yes, that's obviously a macroeconomic problem that is associated, and a cultural problem. So that at the moment, both our sense of personal and organizational success and our structures of debt require people to continually increase their income individually and as organizations in order to service compound interest on the debts that almost everything and everybody has. And that requires ever increasing destruction of natural resources, ever increasing consumption of natural resources and destruction of ecosystems. That is obviously a trap that is impossible for individuals and organizations to fully escape without a system level change. And something involving a mass rethinking of debt would probably be the most sustainable thing we could do as a species. But the thing that I think we should face, we can usefully face individually and as clients for buildings or as architects or as consultants for buildings, is the things we can do within that damaging framework to fight back against a 400-year-long program in which, since the rise of cheap coal in England specifically, the cost of heat has been dropping ever since then, and the cost of labor relative to the cost of heat has been rising ever since then. And therefore, for 400 years in England and for differing periods around the planet, but now everywhere, it is cheaper to burn fossil fuels than to employ people for an ever increasing range of things. And that means that we have been making a huge proportion of human ingenuity focus on swapping human effort for fossil fuels. And reversing that process is an immensely constructive thing to do by thinking of ways of using our astonishing ingenuity and flexibility and cultural, the ways we can use culture to change what in any other species would be hardwired about what we eat and how we live and what we do. Our culture gives us astonishing ability to adapt around the needs of our ecosystems, and the whole of human prehistory and history shows versions of that happening. And we are pretty close to uniquely failing to do it at the moment. But we can do it because we've always been able to do it in the past. And if tomorrow we switched off all our fossil fuels, we would still be the second most energy rich society there had ever been after today's. And we make these traps for ourselves in which we declare ourselves to be unable to stop burning the fossil fuels because we're economically trapped in it. But we invented the economy. Money is a completely human construct. Neither energy nor atmospheric carbon dioxide is. So we need to reinvent the bit that we make, that we have total creative freedom over, to respect the physical realities. Whereas at the moment we are accepting knowingly a disastrous change to the physical context out of a misplaced respect for our own creative products of the past.
In the meantime, we have, talking about products of the past, in the meantime, we have some very glorious examples. And to sort of round this discussion off, I'd like just to go back. You mentioned, I want you to give me the name of it again. You directly compared the Paul Rudolph government complex with Penn Station in terms of architectural integrity, gloriousness, however you describe it. Maybe some of the listeners here might want to know the name of that Paul Rudolph government complex. Could you remind us of that?
Yes, it's normally just called the Government Services Centre, and it's quite a few different facilities. And honestly, I'm being kind to Penn Station there because it was a wonderful building. But it's Penn Station is hugely less individually, specifically extraordinary than Paul Rudolph's Government Services Centre. And the other buildings that were anything like it in his oeuvre have now gone. So it's all the more important for that.
And where is that Government Services Centre?
It's right by all the other famous bits. It's 2 minutes from the Calman, McKinnell and Knowles City Hall, in the same general. It over more or less. It's bang in the bit that Jane Jacobs wrote about in the life and death of great American cities, and it's the landscape she's talking about was demolished for it. But it's very close to all the other brutalist icons of central Boston, and it's better than all of them. It's astonishing.
And you mentioned as it were, the trajectory of public taste with regard to brutalist architecture and I do remember you mentioned the National Theatre, and of course that was your PhD. But it's a nuclear power station. Was that a Prince Charles one? I think he said that was a nuclear power station, and lots of stuff like that. And these are flung around, these epithets. And it has been listed. It's come to be regarded, obviously, as what it always was, which is a great palace of culture. And it really is a palace. It was deliberately designed to face up to Somerset House across the river. But do you think we'll ever get to a moment? This is my concluding question. Do you think we'll ever get to a moment when Paul Rudolph government buildings in Boston would be regarded by the general public as being on a par with the sadly lost Penn Station?
Yes, I don't see why not. I think brutalism, when it's that extreme, will always have people who just don't go for it. People who like thatched cottages will never think that Rudolph is the best architect in America in that period. But if you are capable of enjoying Hawksmoor or Vanbrugh or Wren, then you are capable of enjoying Paul Rudolph. If you're capable of enjoying Michelangelo, you're capable of enjoying Paul Rudolph. So they will be exquisite. A delicacy seems wrong since they're so thumping, but exquisite luxuries for those who do get it and do like that kind of aesthetic of alpine gorges rather than rose gardens.
Okay. Well, thank you very much. The person who I think I heard described earlier on as the world's only Barnabas Calder. Thank you very much for this very wide-ranging and international and thought-provoking lecture. So thanks very much, Barnabas, and I'll hand back to Ted now.
Barnabas and Hugh, I just want to thank you for a phenomenal program today. It was insightful. It was thought-provoking. I spent a lot of time in school in Boston, loved that building as well, and endured people who wanted to bulldoze it and Commonwealth's building. So anyway, it's interesting to see how things come round. This was our fourth and concluding presentation in our 2026 lecture series, Brutalism, Architecture, Urbanism, and Representation. I'd like to thank both Hugh and the Trust Vice Chair, Ann Mann, for their extraordinary work in creating this series. It offered a timely reappraisal of one of the most influential architectural movements of the 20th century, and I think it's been long overdue. Information on the British Architectural Library Trust, its activities and programs, and other upcoming lectures and events can be found on our website, thebaltrust.org. Thank you again for joining us.